Hello and welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Have you had a good week? My name is John. Thank you very much for joining me for another exciting Great British Road Journey. This week I've come to Warwickshire. It's mostly a rural county that's famous for two things, Warwick Castle and William Shakespeare. And that's all there is to know about Warwickshire. Or is it? That's the point of these videos. Today we'll be going on a journey across Warwickshire from Shipston-on-Stour to Kenilworth, and as always, to help navigate our way around, we'll be using my 1923 Michelin guidebook, period correct maps, and of course I've found a selection of interesting things to look at along the way. We begin in Shipston-on-Stour, a small town that in the days of my guidebook had only around 1,500 residents, which is not a lot. The town had previously seen success within the sheep, wool and fabric industry, but this only lasted until the mid-1800s, leaving a town with little to no manufacturing industry, and in turn, no real reason to move here. Today, the town has only 6,000 residents, so I assume not much has changed. Shipston-on-Stour takes its name from the River Stour, which runs through the town. It's actually one of 5 river Stours in England. The others are in Dorset, Kent, Suffolk and Worcester, and running across the river is the Barcheston Bridge, on which we find the B4035. The bridge is believed to be of medieval origin. However, the structure we see today dates back to 1698, and it's interesting because its appearance differs depending on which side you look at, and this is because the road and bridge was widened, leading to one side of the bridge being rebuilt using different materials. Okay, let's get on with the actual journey. We're going to head to Stratford-upon-Avon, but rather than take the most direct route, we'll take the back roads, which wind their way through the countryside. Eventually, we'll end up in Long Marston, and it's here that we find a nice old airfield to take a look at. Yes, opening in 1941, RAF Long Marston was home to a squadron of bombers and accordingly featured a 2,200-metre-long runway. The airfield would close in 1954, but its new owner found a use for the massive runway, and that was drag racing. The odd impromptu event was held in the 1970s, but in the 1980s, racing became a permanent thing and Long Marston Raceway was born. The venue would host various events over the years with great success, but as the years went on, the owners began to struggle. With rising costs, health and safety and a whole host of regulations to conform to, it became harder to keep the track running and make a profit. By the mid-2010s, if a property developer came along and said to you, here's tens of millions of pounds to move out, you would. And they did. In 2018, Long Marston Raceway, by this time renamed as Shakespeare County Raceway, closed its doors for good, and in its place will soon be a lovely collection of new houses. However, as you've seen, a lot of the raceway still exists, having escaped demolition, and it's not clear why. Maybe they just haven't got round to it yet, so visit it whilst you still can, because it won't be long before this is all turned into a garden village. Next up, a footpath in Stratford-upon-Avon. This footpath was once the site of the first railway in Warwickshire. It opened in 1826 and it was actually a horse-drawn tramway. It ran for 16 miles between Stratford and Moreton-in-Marsh, and it was built to allow for the easy transportation of goods from the River Avon to the more rural villages of Warwickshire. Not much remains of the tramway, but if you follow the footpath along into Stratford, you'll cross over the River Avon via this bridge. It's known as Tramway Bridge, and it was a bridge for the tramway. The tracks were lifted in 1918, but in 2010 the local council installed strip lights along the length of the bridge to simulate the original tracks. An absolute waste of time because who actually cares? No one. And in 2020 the lights were abandoned because they kept failing and nobody wanted to pay for the repairs. Now you can't come to Stratford and not hear about or do something Shakespeare related. If you don't know who William Shakespeare is, you're an idiot. Alongside the River Avon and a short distance from the Tramway Bridge is a theatre building, and it's an interesting mix of new and old designs, but this wasn't by choice. The Shakespeare Memorial Theatre was built in the late 1800s as a memorial to Shakespeare, obviously. It was completed in 1879 and it's very much in line with the Victorian architectural style of the time, and it looked like it was a fantastic building, but sadly most of it was destroyed in a fire in 1926. It was rebuilt in the 1930s, retaining anything that was left of the original structure, but this newer theatre had flaws in its design, mainly its interior layout, and this led to several alterations being made over the following decades. The most major of works would come in 2010 when the theatre was completely renovated, and the end result is a building that's got a complete mismatch of designs from various moments in time. Time to head out of Stratford, and to do so we'll use the B4086, which will take us to our next destination, Wellersbourne. However, it turns out we're not actually going into the village itself because what we're stopping to look at is just on the outskirts of Wellersbourne. There are two things actually, starting with a recommendation from my guidebook with Charlecote House. It's a huge 16th century manor house set in 185 acres of parkland, and as of 1946 it's been looked after by the National Trust. The main house was built in 1558, but there aren't any details on the method of construction, although I don't really think it matters too much because during the 1800s the house was extensively modified by its then owner to meet their requirements. Or rather than an old house, maybe one might like to visit XM655, a Cold War era bomber plane that needs little introduction. It lives on the north side of Wellersbourne Mountford Airfield, a short distance from Charlcote House. Avro Vulcan XM655 was built in 1964 as part of the UK's nuclear deterrent programme, and it's a marvel of engineering from a time when the UK was leading the way in aviation. XM655 saw her last flight in 1984, at which point it was purchased by a businessman with the intention of keeping it airworthy. I suspect he underestimated the complex nature of the Vulcan aircraft and the costs involved with keeping it airworthy, and as a result it was just left to deteriorate. Luckily it was saved and restored, and in 1997 the aircraft began doing display taxi runs, which it continued to do so for years after at various events. In 2022, XM655 made the news following a runway excursion in preparation for an event the following day. A faulty speed indicator led to the aircraft being run at full power for longer than intended, and it just couldn't stop in the distance that was available. Next up is a bit of a detour. Imagine your surprise. We could head directly up to Warwick to look at that famous castle of theirs, but before we do, I wanted to take a look at a structure that isn't quite as impressive, but it's interesting nonetheless. And it's this Chesterton windmill. You'll notice it's a bit more substantial than your typical wooden windmill. It was built in the 1630s out of limestone, and like all windmills, its sails can be rotated to face the wind, and this is done by using a system of rollers in a track plate housed beneath its mill cap. Since its construction, it's seen the odd bit of restoration or repair, but in 1910, after centuries of use, the windmill's main winding gear failed, meaning it couldn't be rotated to face the wind, and the owner of the mill just gave up and abandoned it. By the 1960s, the mill was under the ownership of Warwick County Council, who decided to restore the mill and repair its machinery, which was completed by 1971, and since then the mill has operated open days run by volunteers. In 2006, during an open day, one of the sails would break off in strong winds, injuring a visitor, leading to the sails being strengthened. However, I don't know if you've noticed, but there aren't any sails on the windmill currently, and that's because cracks have recently been discovered and they've been sent off to be strengthened. Detour over, and next up is the town of Warwick, which in the days of my guidebook was a busy town with over 12,000 residents. Although I don't know why. The town wasn't really doing a lot, perhaps the occasional bit of hat making, but that's about it. However, Warwick is home to perhaps one of the most popular tourist attractions in the country. Warwick Castle. This isn't it, this is just some plants and flowers. Parking at Warwick Castle is an absolute nightmare and costs £7, regardless of how long you're there for, so they can sod off. Anyway, Warwick Castle. In the days of my guidebook, it was under the ownership of the Greville family, who had owned it since the early 1600s. And with so many people visiting the castle, without permission, in the 1900s, they set up a toll booth or a toll gate and charged people for entry. In the late 1960s, the castle was transferred to the son of owner Charles Greville, who in 1978 would sell the castle for £1.3 million, and this royally pissed off his dad because it ended over 370 years of family ownership. Get it? Royally pissed off because it's a castle? Alright, I'll move on. Of course, my guidebook suggests a visit to Warwick Castle, but it also suggests a visit to a lesser-known tourist attraction called Guy's Cliff House, which is found to the north of Warwick. It's a ruined house built into a cliff that dates back to 1751. It was used as a hospital during the first small disagreement, and during the second small disagreement, it was a school for evacuated children. In 1947, the house and the estate that it's part of was broken up into sections and sold off to whoever wanted to buy it, and the new owners of the house had the intentions of converting it into a hotel, but for some reason it never happened, and the house has since fallen into a state of disrepair, and now it just sort of sits here. Moving on to our last destination, and just up the road from Guy's Cliff House is the A46, which sort of gets in the way if we were wanting to follow the route as per our old maps. The original road would have sent us along this way, and it would have been like that until 1967, at which point the Warwick Bypass, or A46, was completed and a roundabout junction added, so it's no longer possible to exactly follow the old road. But we'll pick it up again once we get the A46 out the way, and it will take us into Kenilworth, where we find a roundabout. However, it's what we find at the roundabout that's of interest, and it's Kenilworth Clock Tower. It was built in 1906 by a local businessman in memory of his wife, and once he'd paid for it to be built, it was handed over to Kenilworth Council, who continued to look after it over 100 years later. Interestingly, if you take a look at the buildings in this area, you'll notice that they're mostly of modern design, and indeed, during the second small disagreement, this whole area was bombed to shit. and most of Kenilworth's historical buildings were flattened. Most of the historical buildings, but not all of them, and one of the survivors was the clock tower, which sustained a small bit of damage to its top section, but mostly remained intact. In the early 1970s, it was restored back to its original form. In the days of my guidebook, Kenilworth was a third of the size that it is today, with around 7,000 residents. Yet despite this, it was probably more productive. With the arrival of the railways in 1844, industries like brickworks and chemical plants started to appear. However, the main produce of Kenilworth would most likely have been crops like strawberries, cherries or tomatoes, and if we take a look at certain old maps, we notice areas full of nurseries for such things. My guidebook suggests that we might like to visit Kenilworth Castle, which we might like to, but it also suggests a visit to the ruins of St Mary's Abbey, which is a lot easier to get to, so we'll do that. It started out as a priory built in 1124 and was later expanded and upgraded to become an abbey in the year 1291. The abbey was handed over to King Henry VIII in 1538 during a period when he was in the process of shutting down abbeys and similar places, and indeed St Mary's Abbey was dismantled the moment it came into his ownership and left abandoned. The ruins were uncovered during an excavation in 1840 and later in 1880, with a final session of excavation works being carried out in 1922, 1 year before my guidebook's publication. And there we are then, guys. That's all we've got time for this week. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there is of course a button specifically for that. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. That would be wicked sweet awesome. Enjoy the rest of your week, whatever it is you get up to. My name's John. You've been watching Auto Shenanigans, and I'll see you guys next time for another exciting Great British Road Journey. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.